IPMNation.com.
Living in a city, when you're in it, watch the people walk by. And if you listen real close, you can hear them talk about their lives. And some hate it, some love it, some are felt, some are just tired. These are the people in the neighborhood, they just trying to make it out right. See, she never wanna be a New Yorker.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, depending on what time you're tuning in. My name is Dr. John Rich, and this is Dr. John's Neighborhood. I'm happy to have you with me here today. After we do the first part of my show, we're going to be coming back from commercial and talking with a colleague of mine here at Delaware State University named Dr. Amy Rogers. Dr. Rogers' focus here at the school and in her research is on the psychology of gender. And in the interview, we're going to be talking about the expectations and limitations that gender roles place on women. So, for example, the kinds of media images that they see, the types of pressures that they are put on them by their parents or by their peers to act more feminine. We're going to be talking about, for whatever reason, there's a pressure on girls not to do too well in math at around the time that they get to be of mating age. So in elementary school, girls do just as well as boys do in math, but then somewhere around the age of 12 and 13 you see a sharp drop-off. And most psychologists believe that that's not because the girls have reached the limits of their capability. Instead, it's that girls have internalized a need not to be too smart, especially in math, if they're going to have any chance of attracting a boy. So what I want to do in the lead up to this really impressive and interesting conversation that I'm going to share with you with Dr. Rogers is to talk a little bit about how gender roles also hurt men. In the past, I've written about the need for parents to try to be more gender-free when they're raising their children. I've talked about how girls are more likely to be socialized to be submissive and dependent. When they're about to take a risk, they might have a parent try to step in and handle the situation for them. And so, as a result, they may not gain the necessary skills for solving their own problems, at least not to the same degree as boys who are taught to be tough and courageous and to be their own man and to solve their problems. Now, on the other side, girls are given much more license to express their emotions and be vulnerable with their friends. If a boy is to express their emotions too hard or be vulnerable with their friends to too much of a degree, they're likely to be what psychologists say is called policed. They're going to be policed by their friends or by their parents or by their teachers or whoever else might be around. What is policing? So policing is the idea that we learn what the acceptable and unacceptable behaviors are. We learn what they look like. And the way we learn it is through normally jokes and sarcastic comments. I know that I've definitely in my life participated in those kinds of things. If I felt like a man was being too feminine, there might be a joke that involved maybe the word pussy. You've heard that? Don't be a pussy. It's interesting that if a man is expressing a feminine behavior, that we call him by the name of the female genitals. A boy who's upset and cries might be told to suck it up or be a man. A man who expresses anxieties and depression might be ridiculed for being a homosexual. I've talked about that before in some of my writing. So just recently my work has begun to expand outside of writing and radio, and I'm starting to do some counseling. I've heard from female parenting counselors that there's a need for some men to talk to men about the fathering that they're doing, especially fathering with their sons, because there's all sorts of baggage that comes along with the pressure to be masculine. What I'm discovering is that fathers who have sons have particular issues with the emotional side of parenting. They might know in their head that it doesn't matter if their sons don't have any interest in sports just yet. It doesn't matter if their son is an artistic type who dresses a little strangely or likes to sit in his room and draw or paint. But still the worry might flood over them, maybe that their son might be gay, or that maybe if their son isn't masculine enough, it means that they haven't done their job properly. If you press them, they might tell you that they worry that the reason their son is the way that he is their fault. If I was a better father, my son wouldn't be so effeminate. Well, it's just nonsense. And yet, the concerns that these men have are very real. They deserve to be honored. The approach that I like to take with men is to talk with them about the rigid norms of masculinity that are behind those concerns, and to try to advise them to loosen up a little bit. Because when somebody is constrained too narrowly by the norms of masculinity, there are some very damaging outcomes that can result. There's a recent study just this year, actually, in the American Journal of Men's Health, where these researchers were trying to look at the norms of masculinity. So what are those norms of masculinity? Well, you probably recognize them. They include dominance and violence and being against anything that is overly feminine. They include self-reliance. If you're having a problem, you need to figure it out yourself. They also include emotional control. You're in control of your emotions. A person, a man or a boy who expresses too much giddiness is going to be ridiculed. A boy or a man on the other side who expresses too much anger is going to maybe be called like a meathead or something. There's just this very narrow path that you're allowed to walk on if you're a man before somebody is going to step in and say that you've lost some kind of emotional control. And the loss of emotional control is often going to lead to some kind of comment that is akin to the policing that I was talking about before. So in this study, the researchers looked at men who adhered to very rigid norms of masculinity and found that there are a lot of undesirable outcomes that can occur. Negative emotions, including depression, aggression, hostility, and poor overall psychological well-being. So it begs the question, how does all that happen? How does it happen that a person who is constrained by needing to be masculine all the time, having to abide by the pressures to walk that narrow path, how does that lead to those undesirable outcomes? Well, despite the kinds of criticism that Sigmund Freud has received in the past number of decades, I'd like to rely on him as the master of the unconscious. See, in Freud's opinion, he believed that as human beings, regardless of our gender, we all have feelings and drives and impulses that are a part of living the human experience. And if people gave into those drives and impulses to the fullest extent, there would be chaos. If you, every time you felt anger, lashed out in your anger without taming it, there would be some terrible results for you and the people who receive the brunt of your anger. If every time you felt depressed or anxious, you gave into it and you curled up in a ball and didn't leave your room, you'd lose your job or have some troubles inside of your family. You need to figure out a way to control those emotions. And as we mature, there's a whole bunch of sources, our parents, civilization, society, higher education, who train us to censor those impulses. What I want to argue is that masculinity is a particularly insidious and made-up idea that requires men to repress a whole host of emotions and drives and impulses that a human being needs to express in order to be able to be fully functioning. So repression, according to Freud, is the main way that we develop to defend ourselves from judgment. That judgment is from other people who might accuse us of being overly feminine or homosexual. And they also end up getting internalized so that when you have those feelings and desires, you are feeling badly about yourself. You're judging yourself as shameful. So if we've internalized a need to be masculine, any thought or desire or feeling that's contrary to what masculine has come to mean has to be censored. And yet Freud believed that for humans, renunciation is very difficult. He referred to a theory that was brought up in the year 1709, where he talked about the process of repression like a relief valve on a hydraulic machine. So if you let this machine operate for too long, the air pressure in the machine builds up so much that it has to be released or the machine will blow up. So there's a valve on the machine that allows for the pressure to be released, and then the machine can continue to operate. Well, people are just like those machines. If we repress our feelings or desires for too long, the pressure from the pent-up energy gets to be too much, and those feelings and desires, try as you might, need to come out in some way. So the fear that people who are worried about being judged for not being masculine, the fear that they're going to be judged, has to be released in some form. If you're constantly holding back the feelings of depression and anxiety that every person has across their life at times, if you're constantly holding back on feelings of exhilaration that every person has at times because you don't want to be overly emotional and you don't want to be judged, that build-up tension, that pent-up energy that exists as a result of you repressing those feelings is going to be released. If you don't release it in a way that's proactive, such as admitting to somebody that you're having those feelings, or going to see a therapist. Men are notorious for not seeing therapists because they have to solve their own problems. These are ways for you to express those feelings and let that pent-up energy be released. But if you feel like you can't do it, and you're holding it, and you're holding it, and you're holding it, eventually it explodes in a way that is almost uncontrollable. So men who are overly constricted by their gender, whose fear of being ridiculed for behaviors that aren't masculine enough, have an increased likelihood to release the tension from their repression in negative ways. The researchers found that men are more likely to engage in behaviors that are what they call self-harm. They're more likely to burn things or hit themselves or bang their heads against objects or punch walls or engage in risky behaviors like driving dangerously or doing too many drugs or drinking too much. It's crazy, right? That you know that driving dangerously could get you killed, and yet We all also know that the norms of masculinity say that true men don't care about being killed. If you point a gun at a true man, he doesn't pee his pants. He doesn't get scared. He doesn't cower and whimper. He looks right down the barrel of the gun at the holder of the gun and says, "I'm not afraid." Bullshit. Anybody who's got a gun pointing at them is feeling some kind of fear. Anybody who's about to engage in a fight is feeling some kind of fear and adrenaline rush. And even with that adrenaline rush, you're not allowed to express it. It's craziness. So the authors say that adherence to masculine norms is associated with all sorts of negative emotions, and also the ways that men experience and express and respond to those emotions. Sadness, depression, anxiety, fear, all these things are the outcomes of holding inside authentic feelings that the person has decided they're not allowed to express because they wouldn't be masculine enough. So the threat to men who've accepted this narrow definition of what it means to be a man is real. Self-harm, depression, anxiety, aggressive attacks on others can be the consequence of having to hold in thoughts and feelings that could expose you to ridicule or judgment. And what I want to say to the fathers out there who know that they're battling with what it means to be a man in the 21st century, what I want to say is that if you're aware that the ways that you're expressing yourself are unhealthy, and you're aware that you've given in to this made-up concept called masculinity, and that it's harming your relationships with other people, be aware that your son is watching and learning what it means to be a man from you. If you feel like you've got a narrow set of destructive ways of releasing your emotions, you're punching the wall or yelling at your spouse or drinking too much, your son is learning. Right now, your son is learning that that's how you handle emotional trauma. I think it's high time that all people be relieved of the burden of this bullshit construct of gender. Are you ready? Your genitals do not define you. You're a person. You're allowed to act the way that you want to act as your feelings and desires manifest themselves. And your children need to learn to value and express the best characteristics of both genders as they're appropriate to the situations in which they find themselves. What we really need to do, in my opinion, is whenever we're confronted with something that holds us back, our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, not that those things hold us back, but that the ideas that our culture and the people around us have about how people are supposed to behave if they have a certain characteristic. Whenever we encounter the idea that white people aren't supposed to act like this, black people aren't supposed to act like that, gay people are this way, straight people are that way, men are this way, women are that way, when we encounter those restrictions, we need to acknowledge that those restrictions, wherever they came from, are building up pressure. They're not allowing us to act as fully authentic human beings. And the contribution that we can make to the world depends on us feeling like we have the freedom and the allowance to act in accordance with our conscience and our beliefs and the feelings and the desires that we're all going to have. So, what's the main message? I think we all need to strive to just be human beings and to give each other and ourselves a break. We all need a break. Thanks for listening. I'm going to go to commercial now. When we come back, you're going to get to hear a really great conversation with my friend and colleague, Dr. Rogers. Talk to you after the commercial.
10 years ago, the energy market was deregulated. This opened the market to new suppliers. Ambit Energy is one of those suppliers. Go to ipmnation.ambitrabbit.com and see how you can not only get free energy by switching to Ambit, you can also earn travel reward points while lowering your utility bills. Learn more by going to ipmnation.ambitrabbit.com. Start saving today.
ipmnation.com.
And we're back. Thanks for sticking with us. I'm here in my office at Delaware State University with a colleague of mine, Dr. Amy Rogers. Say hello.
Hello.
That was a higher pitched hello than I'm used to.
It came out funny.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So I'm grateful to you, Dr. Rogers, because the only reason that I work here, I mean, you're the reason that I work here. I woke up one day and got an email from you saying that they were looking for somebody to take this position, and I responded, and the rest is history. So
Here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about it? I'm still here 9 years later.
Excellent.
Who would have thought? Yeah. You were here how many years before me?
If you've been here 9, then I guess 6, 7. So I'm in 15 years.
15.
I'm at 15.
Wow. All right. Well, this place has some high attrition, and only the people who are committed to the work seem to stick around. So
We're survivors.
yeah, good. All right, so the reason that I asked you to be on the show is because you have a specialty that I think is really timely right now with the Me Too movement and all of the stuff going on, Harvey Weinstein, and add to the list of high-profile people, including somebody in government. I can't remember exactly who has. Yeah. So it's a timely issue. You talk about and teach about the psychology of gender.
Yes.
So I guess I'm thinking about things that you've said before where when you teach the psychology of gender, there's some pushback from especially the male students. And I think in this culture you could definitely find men who, upon hearing someone say something about sexism, might curmudgeonly say, well, sexism is over. Come on. You've got the right to vote. You're allowed to go and work outside of the home. What
Wear
more do you want?
pants and everything.
Yeah, you can wear pants, right?
Yeah.
So, but you say no to that. You say that sexism still exists. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
And some of it still exists, obviously, in kind of the overt ways that we might think of in a more historical context. You know, men who still believe women should be home and subservient and catering to their needs, with religious emphasis, some just because of their own desires. But honestly, I think a more serious and kind of widespread issue is the issue of implicit bias.
Implicit bias. Okay, right. You talked before about it's kind of like a 1-2 punch. There's this implicit bias and stereotype threat, and I know we want to talk about that. So for people who've never heard the term implicit bias, what is that?
Implicit bias is the bias that we can have without our own awareness. So that we behave in ways that are sexist or racist or classist or whatever, but we're not even really aware that we're doing so.
Okay.
Because it's unconscious. It's in our, it's affecting our behavior, but we're not seeing that it's affecting us.
This could be the reason that some people push back against the idea that they're sexist, because they're not going around rubbing their hands together thinking to themselves, how can I keep women down this week?
Right.
So how does it act implicitly? You know, how does it get into our unconscious?
Well, we all share the same dominant culture. We all live in this culture. We're exposed to pretty much the same set of commercials and movies and TV and music and political stories and cultural content, events going on. And it always will be cast and spun largely through the eyes of people who tend to hold power. And those people tend to be white, they tend to be male, they tend to be wealthy. And so their perspective, that perspective, will kind of pervade pretty much every institution to some extent, every cultural emblem, icon, every avenue will have a little bit of a lean to that direction where that perspective is given predominance, where it's the main perspective.
Right. So I know when you teach social psychology, when you teach that class, that you have an acronym for who are the powerful, and it's worms, right? So what's
Yes.
worms? And do it slowly so that we can follow the letters.
White, old, rich,
right,
male, and straight.
Oh, okay. Well, that's me, right? Well, maybe not the old part. Yeah.
No, you're old.
No, I'm pretty old. Yeah. Okay. So, well, I don't know that I'm rich. I guess it depends on who you're comparing me to.
Right.
But the idea behind this WORMS acronym is that the more of those letters represent you, the more privilege you have, or the easier it is for you to get the benefit of the doubt. Is that a good way of saying it?
And that the system will represent you and reflect your needs and benefit you.
Okay.
And the less you have in common with that group, the less the system will advantage you and speak your perspective.
So to what degree do you think that implicit bias ends up in our brains more because we're sucking in messages when we're children and we're not yet able to think critically about what we're seeing?
Definitely.
Okay.
Implicit bias is specifically conceptualized as being related to early childhood development, early childhood experiences, and messages and themes that we get. So you can even look at the content of children's stories, which is among the most sexist.
Tell me one. Tell us a children's story that we've all heard, and tell it through the lens of what you're trying to say.
Well, Cinderella, right, is beautiful and poor and oppressed, but beautiful, and she's oppressed by ugly, right? So beautiful and ugly is a very strong socializing theme for girls. We put a lot of energy and effort into telling girls and women that what matters about them is how they look. Go to the toy aisle, for girls, and how much of that is dedicated to makeup and hair and dress up and costumes and how to adorn yourself and look attractive.
And the villainesses
are ugly
people.
Right.
Little Mermaid,
they're always ugly.
Ugly
women,
whatever her name is. How about that? Okay.
And then that she'll be rescued if she's pretty enough, right? If she's pretty enough, she'll be rescued by a man who will take her away from whatever oppression or poor experience she's had. I mean, there have been some efforts to try to make children's stories more gender neutral, but really what we tend to see in those is a both and. So girls can now, in more modern day stories for children, the girls can go on adventures and be, fight battles and win.
Right.
But they still need to be beautiful. They still need to be helpful and kind and polite. So it's not that the old stereotype has been replaced by one that is more agentic or active, but it's been added to, that women both and, right? Gender plus.
So
feminine.
they still have to be pretty. But now they're
sweet
and
allowed,
okay,
polite.
So
and
is that
kind.
gender too? Is that a gendered expectation that people be kind and polite?
Yes,
okay.
yes. That women, I'll often ask in my gender class, so how many of you have had someone come up to you and say, smile, what's wrong? Why aren't you smiling? And all the women will raise their hand, and the men will look confused because they can't even imagine that someone might come up to them and insist that they smile. Okay. Right? That it's not okay for a woman to not have a positive mood, that she must be pleasing and pleasant, and portray herself that way.
And that's also outward appearance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, so let's go back to how that gets implicitly into the unconscious of these small girls.
Okay.
So let's think about a hypothetical 7-year-old who's just going around the world right now. What kinds of what messages is she receiving?
She's receiving messages that how she looks is more important than anything.
Okay.
It's especially more important than what she knows.
Right.
What she does is important, especially in terms of what she does in service to others. Mm-hmm. Does she help her little brother? Does she help her mommy? Is she...
An emphasis on social adeptness, right? Men are allowed to be more rude, and
boys will be boys, right? We excuse behavior for males, right? We say, "Oh, boys will be boys," right? And she will that certain things are for her and certain things are not for her.
Like what?
So helping is for her. Winning is not for her.
Okay.
So being support but not being the leader, right? Not being a support worker, supporting figure but not the leader. Being good at English but not good at math or science. Not wanting to be too physically active, or if she is, in very narrowly described sorts of ways that are beautiful.
Okay.
Right? Don't want to do any physical activity that doesn't look beautiful. So cheerleading's okay,
right.
Dance is okay, ballet, that type of thing. So she's hearing that. It's interesting, you picked 7, and I would probably move it to 12, because our culture does value children pretty well.
Okay.
And the research shows that little girls have about the same self-esteem as little boys. They like themselves. They stand up for themselves. It's not till you get into those right before puberty, pre-adolescent sort of years.
Right, I read this, that there is, like, even in math performance, that girls will keep up with boys in math, and then as a whole there's like a drop-off at a certain point, and that can't be explained by, well, they've hit the limits of their capacity to understand.
No.
It's that there's some pressure to not do as well.
Right.
But how does that play out? How does a girl who's been doing well in math all of a sudden hear the message, however it's being delivered, that it's going to be better for me if I act a little stupider when it comes to math?
She's starting to be interested in attracting boys.
Okay.
Right? She wants the boys to like her. And so, since girls are a few years ahead, usually, socially, and physically, frankly,
right.
At that point, she's ahead of him. He's not yet terribly interested in her. And so she's racking her mind. What can I do to be more attractive? What can I do to be better liked? And no one likes to be beaten. And then if you add on top of that the cultural idea that women should never beat men, right? That's somehow a worse insult. If a man's beaten by another man, that's bad.
Beat by a girl.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, that's somehow
Yeah.
awful,
Right. Right.
Well, then she doesn't want to win because she buys into the idea that in order to be attractive to him, she has to appease his ego.
Another thing that's fascinating about that is that I can't picture a real life scenario where a girl is interested in a boy. Let's say we're talking about a 13-year-old girl and a boy. The girl is interested in the boy. She lets that be known, and the boy says, I would have been interested, but you're just too good at math. Like, that's not going to occur to him to say that explicitly.
Right.
It's that this implicit bias that you're talking about, she has picked up that that's an area where I can't excel if I'm going to be successful at this thing that I'm supposed to.
Attractive girls don't do this.
Okay.
You know, attractive girls care about how they look, not how they perform in school.
Okay.
Attractive girls giggle and laugh at his jokes rather than say, that wasn't funny. Right? Attractive girls. You know, the Gone Girl, the cool chick. With the cool chick?
Gone Girl.
The movie Gone Girl.
I know of it, but I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just, it's a blazing critique of, you know, the cool girl, you know, eats hot dogs and never gets fat. She laughs at your jokes. She, you know, all the things she is and all the things she's not, to be the most desirable to men. Right? But
so is that like that's a full-on concrete description of implicit bias? Is that how the movie played out?
I hadn't really kind of framed it that way. I'd have to think about it a little longer maybe, but you know, this sort of notion that these girls are becoming very aware or stressing the importance of in their mind of this set of traits that will make them appealing to boys. And most of those traits are not success bound. You know, they're not related to achievement or success or self-actualization or self-affirming, or, right, it's all, how can I please him? How can I make him feel good? How can I improve how I look so that he finds me more desirable?
Yeah.
And so it's at that age that we begin to see. Now, both boys and girls get a drop in self-esteem as they enter into puberty.
Right.
But girls drop much further than boys, and girls never recover. Boys do recover. So as they move through adolescence, by the time we start getting into our late teens, boys have recovered. Young men have recovered their childhood levels of self-esteem and will continue climbing into adulthood. Girls and women never reach their childhood levels of self-esteem again for the rest of their life.
Wow. Now I do want to
course.
make that point.
Yeah.
That every time psychologists or social scientists
Right.
say something about this is what happens and that's what happens, you hear some detractor or troll out there saying, well, when I was a kid, blah, blah, blah.
It's not true of me.
That's not true of my
Yeah.
cousin. My cousin is a
Right.
blah, CEO or whatever.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about every single person 100% of the time. We're talking about in the aggregate, when you're looking at groups, there are these trends, and the trends are pretty powerful.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's something I always emphasize in class also.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say it so that if anybody else out there is crossing their arms and saying, huh,
It's not true of me.
yeah, well, you can keep that opinion to yourself, because there are always outliers, right? Yeah, something that you said earlier reminded me of something in the psychology of humor, which is an area that I study. And so they were talking about a sense of humor as part of what people find attractive. And one of the things that came up in an article that really struck me was that women say that they want a man who's funny and has a good sense of humor. Men say they want a woman with a good sense of humor who laughs at what they
Their
say.
jokes, right?
Right. So the women want the men to tell jokes, and the men want the women to laugh at them. But it's not the other way around. If the woman is funnier, that is as threatening as maybe being in a relationship with a woman who makes more money than you.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that what the research shows?
Yeah.
If she's funnier.
If funnier than me is threatening. Funny is okay as long as I'm the funny one.
Interesting.
Yeah. Again, in
I'm
the
not-
aggregate, everybody.
I'm not aware of that research. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I'll share that with you.
Okay.
Okay, good. So now we got to lead into the second punch, because you talked about how implicit bias is like all the external messages that are the patina of our culture.
Right.
And produce how people are, conceptualizing what a girl's supposed to be like and what a boy's supposed to be like.
Right. They're developed
There's a
in childhood.
Uh-huh.
And then they affect us in our automatic unconscious sorts of decisions.
Okay.
So when we're acting, especially in a automatic sort of way, just kind of going through living our life, these implicit biases can have a huge effect on our behavior and our expectations and our treatment of others.
Okay. And earlier you said that one of the ways that manifests itself is with something called stereotype threat. So what is that?
So stereotype threat is sort of turning those implicit biases inward in such a way that it affects our performance. So some of the original research, for example, you can tap into any stereotype that exists out there. One dominant stereotype is that women and girls aren't good at math and science. Okay, so and then you have two groups of people. Both of them have both men and women in them, or boys and girls. You give everybody the same math test.
Okay.
Right? Everybody takes the same math test.
Right.
Half of the people, though, you tell this is a math test. You leave it alone.
Okay.
And the other half of the people, you say this is a math test where men and women do the same.
Okay.
Okay. But in reality, everyone's taking the same test.
Okay.
All right. What you find is that on the test that people think is just a math test, you'll find pretty large differences, so that the men and boys will outperform the women and girls.
Okay.
They'll do better.
In both
In
groups.
the group.
In the group
The
where...
group that's told it's just a math test.
Okay. And so what's the threat? You stereotype
Not yet.
threat.
The other part is the other group.
Oh, there's
Okay.
a third group.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the second group where I've told you that this is a test where men and women do the same.
Yeah.
I have removed the threat of the stereotype. Right?
Okay.
I've said that stereotype doesn't apply
Don't
to
worry
this math, this
Okay.
test. And what we find is that men and women will do the same on the test. Right. The same test. Everybody's taking the same test. So if I believe that it's a math test, I don't do as well as a woman than as opposed to if I believe it's a math test that men and women do the same on.
Okay.
What we found is
But it's all the same test.
everybody's taking
Everybody's
the
taking
same
the same
test.
test.
So the gender gap in performance is there when we say nothing. We say it's a math test. And it disappears when we say it's a math test where there's no gender differences. What we have kind of a second generation of research on implicit bias has found is that it has to do with persistence. So the key is persistence. So when things start getting difficult, I'm a girl, I'm sitting there taking that math test and it's starting to get hard.
Okay.
If I believe that people like me don't do well on this task, I give up.
Okay.
And I don't try as hard as I might. If, on the other hand, I'm in the group where I've been told girls do just as well as boys on this test, right? When things get hard, I say, well, people like me do well on this task. I can probably do well too, and I persist, right?
Okay.
And so this is the effects of the dominant culture that we turn against ourselves. This is one of the reasons I really emphasize it in my classes, because that's so insidious. You know, it doesn't take the actions of a particularly discriminatory boss or teacher or whatever authority figure. They don't have to say, well, you did as well on the test, but I'm not going to give you credit for it. This we are doing to ourselves, right? Disadvantaged groups. And by the way, stereotype threat, we can find it against white men also.
Right.
So
the white men can't jump study?
well,
Is that the one you're going to talk about?
I don't know if it's the white men can't jump. There's one on when the group you're with is Asian men.
Okay.
White men don't do as well in math.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Or running, speed, sports agility. And maybe that is the white men can't jump study. I haven't heard it referred to as that.
There's a study where you take a bunch of white people and there's a guy with a clipboard measuring how high they can jump. They have to jump and touch the wall, and he measures it. And when the person behind the clipboard is black, they don't jump as high as when the person with the clipboard is white. Even though they haven't said anything about white people, everybody's internalized this idea that
white people can't jump.
But the part of it that I thought you were going to talk about, and the way that I always took the stereotype threat literature, was not the persistence part, and that's interesting, but the idea that if there's a stereotype that is in your mind, that you might feel pressured to have to prove that the stereotype is wrong, and now there's a part of your mental energy that isn't dedicated to the task, it's dedicated to this resentment that you have.
And that's one of the first sort of conceptualizations of stereotype threat, where pressure of the stereotype, my knowledge of the stereotype puts pressure on me, and that arousal or nervousness or lack of focus causes me to underperform on the task.
But the literature doesn't agree with that anymore. Is that what you mean?
Doesn't disagree with that.
Okay.
That was the original theory. That was the original hypothesis. And then they've tested it and shown that it works out that way. The mechanisms, we find that kind of in the tokenism research, where anybody who's the only member of their group, right? So if I'm the only white in a group of blacks, or the only black in a group of whites, or the only man in a group of women, right? The only woman in a group of men, that it will hurt my performance on tasks because of distraction, because of fear of confirming stereotypes. And that was kind of the early push of the stereotype threat research. It has since sort of taken off into different directions. And I don't think that they've excluded the role of I'm afraid I'll confirm this stereotype as a mechanism. I think that is especially relevant in face-to-face sort of performance. What I've also looked at is sort of paper and pencil performance, how I do on a task writing, where it's not you and I talking and it's a group exchange, but it's me performing on a test. And that we know is at least somewhat related to persistence.
I mean, I've always likened it to when I was younger, I didn't feel very good about my sports ability. And so here comes the ball coming to me and I have to catch it, and I'm so worried that I'm going to miss the ball that most of the time I miss the ball.
Right. You overthink it. You worry too much. Right. The fear of failure makes you fail.
All right.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on the end of our time here, and I wanted to make sure that we took this very fascinating academic work, although it doesn't feel like it's just academic anyway, wanting to take it out of the laboratory and apply it to everyday life. So let's just kind of think about a person who's listening right now, whether it's a man or a woman, and they have it in their mind that they want to continue on the road to self-improvement. We're not trying to convince them that sexism is real, and we're not even trying to convince any of the men out there that maybe they get some advantages from being men. Let's just assume that who we're talking to right now already buys into all that as a reality. They want to help overcome implicit biases. How does a person go about doing that in the real world?
Yeah. Good news. We have a way.
Oh, there is.
Yeah.
So we're not doomed.
No, we're not doomed.
All right.
For starters, knowing about implicit bias helps some. Right. So just knowing that implicit bias is a more automatic process, a more unconscious process. If we're in situations where there's the possibility of a gender influence, if we become a little more conscious and a little more deliberative, we do better, right? So just being aware that if I'm not paying attention to it, my default may be these unconscious biases.
That seems like, in a way, the entire point of psychology is to try to help make things that are unconscious more conscious,
right? With
the idea that we can
do better
if we know what's lurking in the background. Yeah.
But
Okay.
there's also some real interesting kind of newer research on actually changing the way the brain is sort of wired.
So neurobiology
Yeah.
kind of thing? How about that? All right.
I call it loud thinking. So your brain forms connections between often repeated constructs, often repeated ideas. So women are emotional. You hear this idea, you're exposed to this idea over and over and over. So this link between women are emotional gets formed in your brain as a very strong neural connection. And it's easy for the link to jump, easy for the thought to jump from women to emotional.
Just because of the frequency of seeing those two things together.
Right, because they've been presented so often.
Okay.
So when you're not trying and not conscious and not making an effort, and you have a choice, I need to hire 2 managers, one's a man, one's a woman, you pick the man because that link between woman and emotional says, oh, emotional's not so good for management.
Yeah.
Right?
What am I going to do? Every 28 days, this woman's going to fly off the handle.
Right. So, but of course, you brought up 28 days.
Oh,
You're
okay.
going to get
Sorry.
me on a whole new thing.
I threw it off. All right.
That's okay. Men's cycle too. That's
Yeah.
a new research we
Right,
can do.
right.
But anyway, if you want to change these connections in your mind, you can kind of intentionally and purposefully do it through kind of what I call loud thinking. So when you see a woman, think capable, level-headed, whatever sort of image you want to have in there, and think it kind of, you can't just think passively, oh, a woman capable. You gotta capable, kind of intentionally screw up your face and think it hard.
Okay.
And just practice that. Just, you see a woman and think strong, or whatever message you want to develop in your brain. And what you'll do is you'll create a connection between the concept of strong and the concept of woman, or the concept of level-headed or rational or powerful or help, whatever you want, right? And then what we know is that your implicit biases linking women and weak or women and emotional gets weakened, and the connection between women and this other notion gets strengthened.
So you're rewiring your brain.
You're rewiring your brain.
How about that?
For those times when you engage in low effort, automatic sort of thinking, right?
Okay.
Habitual, quick reaction times when you're distracted, when you don't care very much. These are all times
Or
you
stress, right? If you're stressed, then
stressed, right?
you're just responding.
Right.
Uh-huh.
If you want to make a change, you can do that, and not just gender. You can do it also, of course, in race or socioeconomic status or sexual orientation or any group that you have any indication, an inkling sense that maybe there's something in there, or frankly, there is something in there. Right? You should just know. You've lived in this culture. You can rewire those things, and frankly, rewire them for yourself and your own groups too, not just for the groups you don't belong to, but for the groups you do, because these dominant messages, they're fed to all.
Right. So
us.
even though you're a woman, you still have that implicit bias against other women, right? You've been fed this diet that these other women are also emotional, or
except I've worked on mine for 100 years,
Okay.
so I probably don't have as much as most. But
Right.
I will say, research pretty consistently shows that women are almost as sexist against women as men. That, for example, blacks are almost as racist against blacks as whites.
in terms of the decisions that they might make.
In terms of research explorations of doing, when we study sexist and racist sorts of outcomes in studies, behavior, the group you measure doesn't have a huge effect on the fact that we find people are biased against minorities, people are biased against women, and it doesn't really matter a whole lot what group you are a member of, especially when we get to the implicit level.
Yeah.
Right? So if I ask you overtly and say,
Are you sexist?
Right. Right.
I'm
Do
not.
you think men and women should be paid the same amount? Right. Those types of things, really straightforward, no. But when you get to more who would you give the job to,
Uh-huh.
right? Where I don't tell you the whole point
What
of this
you're
is
looking
whether
at.
it's a man or a woman,
Right.
right? Those kinds of things where it's not obvious what's being studied.
And I know that there's anyone out there that wants to do this. I know you can go to Google and type in implicit attitude test, and there are things that you can do that'll make you take certain types of faces and link them with certain kinds of adjectives, and you'll often find, even if you're aware what the hypothesis is, which is that adjectives that match the stereotype will be easier to link than adjectives that go against the stereotypes, even though you know that that's what they're looking for, you'll still end up revealing the degree to which you've learned that these things are true.
It's an activity that is one of the choices my students can do for an assignment in several of my classes, where they can go on and take some implicit bias tests. And even though I tell them how it functions and what it's about and that type of thing, I'm always amazed at how many of them say, well, it said I'm moderately, inclined to think women in the home and men in career, and that I'm...
And I don't.
But I don't feel that way. It's wrong. This test doesn't mean anything.
Right.
It was just the way it was set up, or, and of course it's scientifically balanced, and, so the things that they try to claim are causing the problem the study has controlled for. But, they don't consciously know that they have these biases. And the people who don't consciously know, probably when they're being effortful, when they're being conscious in their decisions, might do pretty well, if they're being honest with themselves, right? But it's those automatic, under stress, under time decisions that you don't care about, decisions, those kinds of things that are likely to be affected.
Yeah. So, in the interest of being compassionate toward people, sometimes psychology will teach us something about ourselves that doesn't necessarily make us look all that good. And I like to try to tell people that if you find out that your culture has created associations that make you sexist or racist or homophobic in some way, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person. It means that you've got some things in there to work on. And that psychology to me is about courage. It's about having the courage to say, this is a flaw of mine,
right? And
starting today, I'm going to try to address it.
I talk about it like an onion.
Okay.
That you peel the layers, but there's another layer, right? There's another layer. So I'm always examining myself. As a white woman, I figure I'm very lucky in that I'm the member of an advantaged group, a white person, and a member of a disadvantaged group. As a woman, I can step into both shoes and do some valuable perspective taking, right? On how it feels when whites are accused. Well, that must be how men
Creates
feel.
An analogy
right?
for you.
And it allows me to kind of flip the script a little bit and see both sides. But I always look at it as, what's the next layer? What's the next layer of my quest to be someone who fully and completely represents a perspective of social justice, respecting the individuality of all people, and this need to peel off another layer as I grow and move on in my journey. So,
right. If you don't need self-improvement, then you are perfect. Yeah. So all the perfect people out there, send me an email.
No need.
And I'll have you on the show. Yeah.
That'll be great.
Dr. Rogers, thanks so much. That was we went over time, and I don't even care. I'll just when I pre-record the first part, I'll just cut back on the times. That was very enjoyable and meaningful, and I think there's even some inspiration for us to have the courage to face up to our own implicit biases and try to work on them. Yeah. Can be exciting. It doesn't have to be a drudgery or something that affects your self-esteem. It can just be a challenge.
Well, and gender, one of the things about it, almost, if not all, nearly all of us love at least one person who's the other gender.
Right.
Whether it's our parents, our children, our spouse. We have reason to hope and want and dream for people of both sexes. And so, this seems like it's a natural,
Great. All right. Well, thanks again.
Sure.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Catch you next week.
Living in a city, when you're in it, watch the people walk by. And if you listen real close, you can hear them talk about their lives. And some hate it, some love it, some are felt, some are just tired. These are the people in the neighborhood, they just trying to make it out right. See, she never wanna be a new
IPMNation.com.